Dallas, I don't feel too well.
This is part 2 of the Assassinations of the 1960s as Deep Events by Peter Dale Scott. We will resume with highlight and note 13. 13. Agentur supplied foot soldiers for the CIA's operations in Chile between 1970 and 1975, first in Patria y Libertad, which prepared for the 1973 coup, and later with DINA, Pinochet's drug finance intelligence agency. A principal player in Patria y Libertad was Michael Townley, the leading architect of the Orlando Letelier assassination in Washington. To this day, Townley is thought of in America as a DINA agent, but in Latin America as a CIA agent. What can be said about Pinochet's drug dealer gangs that hasn't already been said? Pinochet was one of the most brutal and repressive dictators I can think of, regardless of ideology. He was a butcher, pure and simple. Washington actually helped put him in power. The Chicago School of Economics, along with the aptly named Chicago Boys, were heavily involved in his coup and subsequent rule over Chile. I consider Chile to be one of the most successful CIA regime changes out there. Without the help of the drug connection, I don't think Pinochet would have been half as rich or half as successful at maintaining power. The fact that Agentur, the intelligence organization fronted by a printing company, sent foot soldiers there says a lot about Ray's potential involvement and affiliation with counterintelligence insurgencies. (14) Stefano del Chiaie, alias Alpha, became a principal assassin for DINA. In 1972, he traveled to Miami with a leading Turkish drug trafficker, Abdullah Kalti, who was simultaneously a killer for the Turkish deep state and a veteran of the CIA's Gladio network in Turkey. The drug traffic through Turkey, in which Kalti was prominent, had been linked by researchers to a drug route from Afghanistan, which at every stage was controlled by members or allies of Al-Qaeda. Agentur Press had been founded in September 1966, less than 2 years prior to Ray's visit, by veterans of the French Secret Army Organization, or OAS, an anti-de Gaulle faction that enjoyed contacts with Angleton in the CIA. By 1968, Agentur was dispatching mercenaries to many parts of the world. Specifically, they were sent to Guatemala, which in 1968 was in the midst of a massive CIA-assisted terror campaign, in which former CIA Cubans and U.S. Green Berets were also involved. Alpha never even had to set foot in Chile to bring them blood money. Drug connection after connection, murder after murder. The fact that Al-Qaeda had control over that area that so happened to coincide with certain other drug operations, namely the Afghani opium and narcotics trade, speaks volumes to the interconnectedness of armed insurgents and drug running. Guatemala was under siege on both ends of this deep state equation, according to Scott's recounting of the events. As they were being cooed into oblivion with staggering economic fatality, they were being devastated on a civilian level by drugs and mercenaries sent to infiltrate their communities and kill their top politicians. Remember that Guatemala was firmly under the US's thumb for many, many years prior. The United Fruit Company, now Chiquita, controlled huge swaths of farmland and industry and cash crops from Guatemala and basically worked in tandem with their politicians in Washington to keep them dependent on the company. Not to mention United Fruit built a large portion of their infrastructure. Where do you think the name Banana Republic came from? (15) Montreal was thus a liaison point for Agentur, and this may explain Ray's brief return there from Toronto in April or May of 1968. Melanson located in Toronto the so-called Fat Man, who on May 2, 1968, 6 days before Ray's arrival in Lisbon, delivered a package to Ray in Toronto addressed to Ray's alias of Raymond Sneed. The Fat Man, to whom Melanson gave the pseudonym of William Bolton, told Melanson that the package was a letter, quote, about a job in Portugal, and it showed that he had help, end quote. Bolton further, quote, asserted that there was big money behind Ray, end quote. The CIA was conducting surveillance on Martin Luther King, and its copious King records treated King as a dangerous domestic threat to U.S. national security. The communist or Negro elements who will be directed by the communists may be in a position to, if not take over the Negro movement, completely disrupt it and hence cause extremely critical problems for the government of the United States. There has been much recent attention paid to Merrill McCullough, a companion of Martin Luther King who was on the balcony where and when King was shot. By all accounts, McCullough was an undercover agent for the Memphis Police Department with a military background, who later went on to work for the CIA. William Pepper collected testimony from Lloyd Jowers that he had been part of the plot to murder King, and that McCullough, who had admitted he knew Jowers, was a co-conspirator in the murder plot. Lieutenant Manuel Pena and Sergeant Enrique Hank Hernandez, the two veterans of the Los Angeles Police Force, both had CIA connections through their training for and participation in police operations in Latin America. Pena also built up a strong connection with Interpol. Mexican Minister of Government Fernando Gutierrez Barrios also falsified records at the behest of the CIA in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald. His agency, the Mexican Federal Security Directorate, or the DFS, had been involved throughout its 3 decades of existence in drug trafficking. Melanson all but confirms Ray had drug intelligence ties or was being used by these forces to do their dirty work while under the guise of being an independent agent. Like I said before, whatever Ray's true intentions were for going to Lisbon and Aginter aren't known to us, but we can assume that he was working on the backs of the intelligence community for guerrilla groups. Remember when I said last episode that there was a million reasons why the Mafia would have wanted to have King assassinated? Well, Scott informs us of the primary one. King was making such a huge splash in American politics and rallying together people of all races like never before. He was also causing more racial violence and distress as a result. With those two elements at play, of course he was a target for murder. If King continued to be an influencing factor in US politics, he would fundamentally shift the narrative and lead to greater racial and class solidarity, which would make the capitalist ruling class very unhappy and the communists pleased beyond belief. Although King was no communist by a long shot, he was still targeted. It was either him or the entire state apparatus. King was betrayed by his own friend, a police officer and later CIA operative, for domestic security reasons. Let us never forget that police are the long arm of the government's paramilitary forces. They make sure we respect property above even human rights and morality. It's no wonder why some defect so quickly. They're used to holding up oppressive power structures in the name of law and justice. A new analysis of the King assassination based on 2 other deep events. 16. Let me begin with a word or two about the dubious detective work on JFK and 9/11. Less than 15 minutes after President Kennedy's assassination, the height and weight of Kennedy's alleged killer was posted. Before the last of the hijacked planes crashed on 9/11, the FBI told Richard Clarke that they had a list of alleged hijackers. In both events, there are reasons to suspect that the information about the alleged suspects came from prior information in intelligence files. In the case of Oswald, within 15 minutes of the assassination and long before Oswald was picked up in the Texas theater, Inspector Sawyer of the Dallas Police put out on the police radio network, and possibly other networks, a description of the killer. Quote, about 30, 5 feet 10 inches, 165 pounds, end quote. This height and weight exactly matched the measurements attributed to Lee Harvey Oswald in Oswald's FBI file, and also in CIA documents about him. The announced weight was, however, significantly different from Oswald's actual weight of 131 pounds, as recorded by the Dallas police after his arrest. The witness said to have spotted him, Howard Brennan, failed to identify Oswald in a lineup. A similar situation pertains to the alleged hijackers on 9/11. For example, shortly afterwards, men in Saudi Arabia complained that the hijackers' personal details released by the FBI, quote, including name, place, date of birth, and occupation, match their own, end quote. If the above information is accurate, then the details posted by the FBI and CNN about the alleged hijackers cannot have derived from the events of 9/11, with which the survivors in Saudi Arabia would appear to have been uninvolved. Some of the hijackers, like Lee Harvey Oswald, may have been in CIA files for a special reason, because the CIA had an operational interest in them. This is mostly self-explanatory. How could this information become public in so little time? If that was the case, you would assume such readily available information would have been procured before tragedy struck. Police, to my knowledge, traditionally don't have access to FBI or CIA records, so how did police put a general description out that matched his exact body specifications? The only way I can conceive of this is if they had previous run-ins with Oswald, for example, and took him to jail where they then accessed his medical records. But that is so far-fetched it's not even funny, especially when you consider the police got his actual weight after his arrest, implying they didn't have it before and that the FBI file wasn't accurate. Same for the Saudi men. The FBI clearly had files on these men before, which is even weirder, since I assume they were Saudi nationals living overseas. Why would the FBI have those records? I know the one guy went to flight school in Florida, but still. Internal CIA evidence of operational interest in Oswald and the hijackers. 17. CIA headquarters sent out 2 messages about Oswald, a teletype to the FBI, State, and Navy, and a cable to the chief of the CIA's Mexico City station. The teletype to the FBI withheld the obviously significant information that Oswald had reportedly met in Mexico City with the Soviet vice consul, Valery Kostikov, who was believed by CIA officers to be an officer of the KGB, perhaps even a specialist in assassinations. CIA officer Jane Roman helped draft both messages. In 1995, she was confronted by 2 interviewers with irrefutable evidence that she had signed off on erroneous information about Oswald in the CIA cable to Mexico City. After much questioning, she finally admitted, quote, "I'm signing off on something I know isn't true," end quote. There is something very wrong when one wing of the US's intelligence network goes AWOL and leaves another important wing in the dark about matters concerning national security. I mean, none of this should be happening in the first place, but the fact that the CIA just went behind the FBI's back and totally excluded them and threatened their agents is a level of messed up that exceeds normal thought. Roman admitted as much when she was confronted, that she was complicit in manufacturing evidence against not only a US citizen, but out of sight from people she is supposed to work in tandem with. That is, quite literally, the definition of going rogue. (18) The National Security Agency, or NSA, overheard, on a Yemeni telephone conversation, information about a meeting in Malaysia which al-Midhar would attend, along with Tawfiq bin Attash, the mastermind of the fatal attack in the USS Cole. CIA leaders were so convinced about the potential significance of the Al-Qaeda meeting in Malaysia, they not only set up surveillance of it, but provided regular updates to the FBI director, Louis Freech, the head of the CIA, George Tenet, and the National Security Advisor, Samuel Berger. Khalid al-Midhar's Saudi passport, which contained a visa for travel to the United States, was photocopied in Qatar and forwarded to CIA headquarters. The information was not shared with FBI headquarters until August of 2001. An FBI agent detailed to the Bin Laden unit at the CIA attempted to share this information with colleagues at FBI headquarters. A CIA desk officer instructed him not to send the cable with this information. Bright himself speculated in a companion essay he wrote for The New Yorker that, quote, "The CIA may also have been protecting an overseas operation and was afraid that the FBI would expose it," end quote. Another example of the above. I wonder why the head of the FBI didn't have any qualms about the information being kept from the officers under him. They share the same interests, don't they? Time and time again, from phone call to passport sharing to the information on Al-Qaeda, you would think a group of people concerned with US national security would worry that one entire sector of it has no information on potential terrorist activity. One FBI officer attempted to share the info, but was warned by a CIA officer not to. Could there have been collaboration going on between the CIA and some other organization that they didn't want the FBI knowing about or passing to the president? On a side note, I wonder how much headbutting goes on between the two organizations on the regular. (19) The CIA's concealing of information from the FBI about Oswald and the hijackers was necessary for the designated culprits to play their allotted roles in the deep events. In both cases, the FBI later complained that the withholding of information was crucial in enabling the deep events to occur. It would be wrong to assume that the withholding of information, though deliberate, had the assassination and plane hijackings in mind. It is perhaps more likely that Oswald and al-Midhar were being protected by the CIA for some other operation, possibly against Cuba, in the case of Oswald, or to penetrate existing Al-Qaeda cells in the US, in the case of al-Hamzi and al-Midhar. Scott answers the million-dollar question for us. The CIA was being evasive because they didn't want the information and operations they were handling to blow up in their faces in case the FBI either exposed the plans or informed the president. I don't think the FBI would have had jurisdiction to go after anybody personally, but then again, they could inform the people who could. The FBI even complained later on that hiding the info caused the events to occur. I guess even the FBI can complain about internal bureaucracy hang-ups. Though, as Scott points out, it is not entirely correct to assume Oswald and the terrorists were being hidden for information's sake, but rather because they had different roles to play in operations that never got off the ground. I'm not going to speculate like Scott does on the possible plans the CIA had, but at the very least, we can assume, with all the evidence presented, he's on the right track. Either way, they were useful in the end and played their parts as assassins well enough that we're still digging into their stories years later. How, and perhaps why, the arrest of James Earl Ray was delayed. 20. I am not assuming that Ray himself had been of interest to the CIA in the same way Oswald and al-Midhar. But Eric S. Galt, the real man whose name was assumed early on by Ray as an alias, was an intelligence insider who was certainly the subject of a sensitive file. A sensitive file must have existed also for the Toronto policeman, Ramon George Sinead, whose name supplied a later Ray alias. It has long been recognized that the selection of Eric S. Galt as an alias for Ray could not have been made by Ray himself, but was a sophisticated choice by someone controlling Ray, of a man who was 1. Roughly similar to Ray in physical characteristics, and even more similar after Ray underwent plastic surgery in 1967, and 2. Part of the national security establishment, because of the classified work he was doing for Union Carbide, both in Canada and the US, on proximity fuses. Galt, quote, was the subject of a very detailed dossier. Whoever had access to it had all the information needed to use Galt's identity as a cover to match Galt to Ray, end quote. My question is this: how did James Earl Ray even acquire the know-how to pick these men's names for his aliases, knowing they were men with sensitive, high-level intelligence association? Did he just get lucky? Did he have insider knowledge, or did someone feed him information? Scott theorizes that someone did indeed pick those aliases for Ray, and that man, whom we don't know the identity of, was so physically similar to Ray that he could pass as his double. This man, Scott goes on to say, must have also worked in intelligence like Ray, who was working in both Canada and America as an intelligence officer with projects for Union Carbide. I wonder if this man helping Ray went rogue, or if he was doing things according to plan. #21. Quote, in fact, Ray's Alabama license, car registration, signature at the new Rebel Motel in Memphis, and assorted forms, letters, and coupons were all Eric S. Galt, end quote. But press reports about the search for the assassin instead used the name of someone who did not exist, Eric Starvo Galt. I believe, on the contrary, that it was the sensitivity of the Galt name, rather than slothfulness, that led to its remaining concealed until just before Ray would be proclaimed as the suspect. Scott uses this section as evidence that Galt's cover could not be blown, because if it was, the entire operation would go up in smoke. Conveniently, just as Ray was being arrested, the same came through on the wire, even though, up to that point, the news media had been publishing the pseudonym incorrectly as Eric Starvo Galt. That name is close enough to the original that it protects the real one without blowing his cover. I can only assume, given this information, that the newspapers, radios, and television journalists worked in tandem with the police and intelligence units to make this happen. Because why would they use a made-up middle name so close to the original if they had physical evidence to the contrary, like a hotel ledger? #22. Apparently, this same sensitivity induced even the HSCA in its report to misrepresent the aliases used by Ray. It reported in 1978 that, quote, when he rented an apartment or a room, bought a car, secured a driver's license, he did so as Eric Starvo Galt, end quote, rather than Eric S. Galt. In like manner, the HSCA misrepresented the name in Ray's passport, Ramon George Sneed, as George Ramon Sneed. 1968 was a year of intense anti-war and civil rights disturbances, of massive surveillance of Americans by Army intelligence, by the CIA through Operation Chaos, by the FBI, and even by the NSA. As Senator Sam Ervin later revealed in a set of Senate hearings, by this time computerized files on civilians were being amassed and shared by all these agencies. It is inconceivable to me that the name of Eric Galt had not turned up in a computer search almost immediately, whether from his security file or from some other file such as an INS file, because of Galt's frequent crossing of the US-Canadian border. One has to keep in mind that the FBI had no trouble locating and interviewing all kinds of unrelated Lohmeyers in America, in the wake of Ray's use of Harvey Lohmeyer as an alias, a name taken from that of a low-level criminal who had worked in a prison kitchen with Ray's brother, John. This is all more of the same. Even 10 years later in 1978, the name Eric S. Galt and Ramon George Sneed are too hot to touch. I think the intelligence community and the HSCA would have made this whole alias fiasco less credible if they just came out and said, yeah, he's using the names of a police officer and this random guy, Galt. For all anybody else knows, the police officer is just a cop and Galt probably had a civilian cover job too. Then the media and civilians would be saying, wow, this suspicious guy stole the identities of a cop and insert whatever Galt's job was here. He seems dangerous. Of course, this is a simplistic thought, but I wanted to pose it nonetheless. And finally, 23. Those plotting the MLK assassination were intelligence insiders, people who knew of Galt's sensitive situation and exploited it in such a way as to ensure that the government would be embarrassed into covering up what really happened on those days. This conclusion would suggest an intelligence component to the MLK assassination at a much higher level than previously noted facts that the CIA was collaborating with local police forces like that of Memphis, or that the CIA had Martin Luther King under surveillance. It also strengthens my strong suspicion that all of our major deep events, including JFK, MLK, and now 9/11, derive in large part from a common source. June 6, 1968, the day that the FBI launched an all-points search for Ramon George Sneed, was also the day on which Robert Kennedy died of his wounds. Ray was then arrested 2 days later, appeasing the growing apprehension among some that assassins were now, with impunity, determining the future of America. There was no ineptitude. Ray was meant to be captured, but only at such time as his apparent feat of justice would counter the atrocity of Robert Kennedy's murder. In this way, Ray's capture served to offset the popular anger and frustration which produced such violent days of rioting after the murder of Martin Luther King. And there you have it, folks. The government was so embarrassed that they abused an undercover man's name and position so an assassination could go off without a hitch. It's murky, but Scott poses a theory that all of these deep events originate from something even higher than the CIA collaborating with the Memphis police force, or any police force for that matter. I have no desire to extrapolate, but when Scott mentions Ray's capture and RFK's death, he has a salient point. America was at an uncomfortable crossroads. Either democracy was going to win, or Murder Inc. was going to run America from then on. Lawlessness would prevail, and democracy would truly die in darkness. Some atavistic plague had captured the hearts of the American public. They grew scared and needed comfort and closure. Thus, the arrest of Ray coincided well. It gave the collective unconscious a soothing balm to heal their wounds. No matter the origin or the truth of the assassination, all the American public knew and cared about was letting the good guys win and restoring equilibrium. And I can't blame them. If I thought my national framework was about to collapse, that material security need would overwhelm my thoughts of justice. It's only human to want the threads tied up so balance can be restored. And thus, we conclude Part 2 of Peter Dale Scott's The Assassinations of the 1960s as Deep Events. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will see you soon in Episode 9. This is Fina saying goodbye. Bye!
Three, 8, 2, 7, 2.